Good evening, everybody. Kunal, welcome to our
Good evening.
broadcast. For those that are in the listening audience, you know that we have been doing these broadcasts twice a week since the beginning of the election, when the election was called. And what many of you don't know is that the reason why we started doing these broadcasts is because my election team challenged me to do so. In addition, what they did is they challenged us to ensure that on the weekdays, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, that we have a caption of my thoughts, which was Anthony says, and then we use those to try to just have persons understand what we were going through. And I will say now that it was a challenge because it meant that every morning, ideally before 7:30, I would have it completed, and I would send it across to my production team, my immediate team, which is Angela Young right now, and Miss Cynthia Jones, and they would post it. And Ms. Young would, of course, critique it before it got posted. So sometimes I had to redo it. And on occasion, depending upon what happened that day, I would actually change it. As one day, for example, I woke up in the morning to a voicemail, or voice note, I guess, from the premier. And so I adjusted my comment to reflect the fact that he was remarkable in accepting responsibility and accountability for one of those things that took place. And so today, Kodal, we want to welcome you. For those in the listening audience, I already posted on my Facebook page that you are probably the most objective and knowledgeable political commentator in Bermuda. And what I say by that is, obviously you have a background in statistics, you do research, and you do polls, which gives you information on a factual basis as opposed to just your opinion. And so that is why I invited you. I'll also smile and say that we are both graduates of the Great War Academy. And obviously you and I have been friends since, I think I met you in 1975, when we first went to academy.
Correct.
And since that time, we've been friends over time. And say that just so that everyone knows, but today it's more to have an objective commentary. Okay. And what I'll do is give comments in terms of my experience this time in number 7, and ask you for input and comments about your thoughts around the election. Okay. And so let's start off by just giving giving us a general comment about your thoughts about the election result.
Well, to begin with, I was probably one amongst the last to know what happened on election night, because I myself was at the polls assisting with the count. And so when I left the polls around quarter to midnight, I checked my phone and I had a message from a friend that said, I thought the PLP would win, but I didn't think it was going to be a landslide, which was rather interesting because they went into the election with 25-11. And so I wasn't quite sure what landslide meant until I got home, and my wife said that it was 36. And so when I did the interview with the BBC, this question came up. Could there be increase in the PLP seats? Could there be a decrease? What happens if there is an overwhelming majority? And at that point, my view was that normally when you give a government more power, then you take the next election or a by-election to sort of rein some of that in. But this election was different in the sense that you had persons who are running in the PLP and also for the OVA who had run before, but you had a number of new candidates. And so ironically, the first question we were asked was about Constituency 7.
Was it?
Yes, in that interview. And so when that came up, I said, well, no, the question was, is that in play for change? And I think Bill Zul went first, and I came back and I said, well, yes, it's in play because you have, I think it was Ms. Harris, or I can't remember her name, your opponent, Ms. Tucker.
Yeah, Robin Tucker, yes.
Right. So you had Ms. Tucker there, who, as I know, is a professional individual, et cetera, who actually said that she lived in the area. She worked in the area, but she didn't live there. And I said, I could work in Paget, but if I ran in Paget, doesn't necessarily mean people are going to know me. But with you living in the area and having run in the election, and I didn't realize at the time, twice before, then with a 21 vote difference, veterans, that was very much in play, particularly with a pandemic. And you have individuals who are going out there who can't meet the voters like they wanted to, who had a very short lead in terms of getting out there if they're a new candidate. And so all of this put it back into that neutralizing fact that I said could happen. Well, then that was taken away and put everything back on the table. So certainly in 7, it was very, very much in play, as were the other areas. For instance, I would have put under normal conditions, I would have put 28 where Dennis listed the third ran. I would have put it back under the OBA column. But because you had a new individual there, if Jeff Sousa was running, right? Because I'm thinking of the neutralizing effect that we gave them too much power. Let's rein it back a little bit. That's why I thought in the initial sense, you would have lost maybe a couple of seats, right?
So, for the listening audience and myself included, what do you mean by the neutralizing factor?
Well, so what I said, when the voters have given the governing party more seats and more power, so they take it outside of Bermuda. Okay, we give the Republicans too much.
Yeah.
So
okay.
midterm, we're going to bring them back and sort of, we might give it to the Senate, so we keep it in check. So here it would have been taking away some seats.
Okay.
But because this was not a by-election, it was a general election, I was saying that this would probably come into play, the sort of controlling factor, or the bringing back factor, if you will. But with a lot of new candidates running, that favored every incumbent candidate that was running again, or those who had run before or ran before. So, for instance, in 7, you had if you had Sylvan Richards running, and take out Cheryl Packwood for just a moment, then it would have been, the likelihood is that you would have closed the gap or possibly won, right? Okay. Possibly won. But the voters would probably say, no, we better keep that one in check, and kept it under the OBA column. So
your I guess your thought is that the government having 25-11, the electorate might have said that's too much. Let's bring it back. Let's
exactly
less of a
you get too much power. Right? Okay, your opposition right here, 11 seats. No. Let's rein them in a little bit. Let them know we're still in control.
Okay.
Right.
So on that basis, does it then mean that because they gave the PLP a greater majority, that the public were that much happy and did not see the need to rein them in?
No, that's where I'm saying when you have new candidates, that was the neutralizing factor. Because when you have these individuals who are new to the voters, and the voters are saying, well, wait a minute, I didn't know this individual. So you're coming along in 7. Oh, we've seen you before. We kind of know who you are, but we don't know this new individual.
Okay.
Right? So I'm not sure about this new individual, but I do know you. So maybe I'm going to give you the vote because I know who you are. Whereas if had it been Sylvan Richards, it may have stayed there, or you still may have won, but a lot closer. You see what I'm saying? So that's what I mean. The controlling factor, or the reining in factor, versus the neutralizing factor.
Okay, well that's interesting, because I know from my canvassing and asking the electorate what the thoughts were, it was interesting to know that one of the critical advantages, if you will, or positive attributes of the election was in fact the Premier's leadership during the COVID, during the pandemic. And I say that because many people commented to me that they would say, well, the Premier has done an excellent job, and we think that the PLP should be given more of an opportunity, or we should give them a chance. And so I wonder the degree to which you would comment on your thoughts around COVID-19 and Bermuda's positive experience, that's the right way to put it, had an impact on the election. Do you believe that my experience in number 7 would have carried forward through the rest of the constituencies?
That's an interesting question. I think, first of all, yes, the electorate was certainly satisfied with Premier's handling of COVID-19. And in fact, in my poll, which I haven't released, if you take the 2 top boxes extremely well, quite well, 92% give them a favorable rating. So yes, and in fact, I was polled by another company, and the interviewer sort of let out that of all the questions, the one that had the most support from all sectors was the handling of COVID.
Okay.
So that was a factor in the government's favor going into the election, because we see it still raging in other places. We
Yes.
see, I just read, I think just a minute ago, 22,000 new cases in the United Kingdom. So still raging very much. But in Bermuda, we've had the only cases that so far coming in are those imported. We have local transmission, but we don't have community transmission. So it has been kept very much under control. So when you look at that, the backdrop against that, and the countries overseas, I think somebody said that David Burt had managed it the best in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
And then there's some truth to that if you certainly want to look at our closest neighbors. So obviously that would have had some influence on the voters going into the election. And so it just depends on how powerful that was. And if they felt that that statement was true, that we've handled it better than most countries on this side of the Atlantic,
right? Okay.
Then, or even on the other side of the Atlantic, you want to include the UK, then that could have translated into a positive outcome. In fact, I think that was one of the reasons that the election was called at this stage, that because you had this goodwill going into the election.
Gotcha. And I'll also add, of course, that the discussion in terms of the time of the election was because for the government, there's lots of work to be done to manage the economy, or to reactivate the economy, in my words. And so it's a good idea to have an election. Now that's been decided, the government has now 5 years, for example, up to the Supreme Court, but they can now have a clear path to make those hard decisions that we all are expecting. So you said you have a poll, you did a poll, has not been released. So I guess my question is then, are you able to explain or disclose whether or not your poll results reflected the actual results?
Yeah, I mean, I brought them along with me because the only reason we only done 150 and we try to do 400, maybe 300, we can get away with it. So the less you do, the larger the margin of error. So this has a margin of error around about 7.5%. But even having polled 150, we had the PLP at 66%. Now we had done 400, that may have gone down to about 62%, or maybe around about 59 or 60. Okay. So it was very much within the margin of error. And we had the OBA polling at that point, and only 12%, but there was a 12% of the voters who were saying that they were insured. So they could have been OBA voters who were not revealing what they were going to do. So I mean, it would have been nice to have done the 400 and we would have had a proper reading, but this was, I wanted to do it to at least have an indication of what the voters were thinking prior to the election.
Okay. And while on this idea of polling, can you explain concisely, I guess, to the public, how do you choose a sample size? Because I know that generally speaking in Bermuda, polls are taken with a sample size of around, say, 400.
Yeah.
But persons sometimes, when the polls come out, they criticize or complain or comment on the fact that how can you do a poll on, say, 400, when Bermuda has 60,000 residents, let's say, and then make a determination or indication or prediction from that's what they consider to be a relatively small number? How do you explain that?
Well, quite simply, it's based on sampling theory. Mm-hmm. My credentials are in sampling theory.
Yes.
And if you do it a proper sample called equal probability sampling, meaning everybody who's eligible to be in your sample has an opportunity to be in your sample, your results should reflect the population. The easy way to answer your question is the United States, where they have perhaps 200 million voters, they do only 1,000. And so in that sense, our polls are far more accurate than the ones done in the United States. And in fact, totally online. This was a hybrid, 50% on 55% on telephone, 45% online. There's challenges in Bermuda, and one of the things is that it's very, very difficult to reach the under 40-year-old. And so my polls tend to stay in the field longer because I want to reach the younger people. I can hit them on the telephone, doing a random telephone sample. I'll get all the seniors, but I will get very few young people. So I go on online, but I find if I sort of put an ad on Facebook, for instance, I'm still skewing 55 and over on Facebook. So it's becoming far more difficult to get the younger voice. So I don't release my polls generally until I'm happy with the amount of younger people I have in my polls. So this one would not have been released. So it's just more for indication purposes.
Okay.
But I would have liked to have seen far more younger people involved before I'm happy with my sample.
Okay. And I asked the question also because when I was going through the canvassing of Heavy number 7, I did get to a point whereby I wasn't sure as to how I was feeling, right? And then I saw that there was a poll result reported in the Rosette, and it predicted a relatively large PLP win. But at the very bottom of it, it said that, but guess what? Last time in 2017, this same company effectively predicted an OBA win and ended up being completely wrong. And that's why I wanted to ask that question and to clarify. And I guess even though you would not want to criticize another polling agency, I'm sure, what would you say succinctly went wrong with that poll? Why would it have been so wrong?
Well, I can't speak to why they went wrong. I can only speak to why mine always go right. And that's because I stay in the field. If I'm not reaching, and it's usually that younger voter that is very difficult. The polls that I do that I release for public consumption are done on my own volition. So they're not paid polls.
Okay.
So I can stay in the field longer. If somebody's paying me and they need the results by X, Y, and Z, then I've got to go before I go. I can wait my data. But if I don't have enough younger people in my poll to reflect how they would feel, then I'm not comfortable. So the polls I release for general consumption tend to be in the field longer, and none of them have been wrong, not one. Even this one at 150, which is skewed toward seniors,
Right.
was showing 66% PLP.
Okay. We are just getting started, everyone. And again, thank you for that. I would, I guess, put the as they say, the cat amongst the pigeons.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts now in terms of, we have the result?
Yeah.
Clearly, the FDM, led by the Honorable Mark Bean, did not get any seats. The OBA, led by the Honorable Craig Kennaner, has a substantially reduced number of seats. So how do you see, or what do you foresee for each of them individually and their respective organizations? Do you see a political future, for example, for Mr. Kennedy?
Well, let's start with the FDM first. A new party, and it's been mentioned that perhaps they've only been in existence for 1 month. So they had really nothing to lose in this election, right? They had 14, I think they ended up with 14 candidates.
Yes.
And they had 14 candidates to start off with. And they picked up about 5% of the vote. So they can only go from strength to strength. It's obviously going to be a long walk up the hill, but they can go from strength to strength. So they really had nothing to lose. I think when it comes to the OBA, this was a critical election. And I had told Michael Dunkley on Facebook that the airport deal was what sunk the OBA at the last election, even over and above immigration reform. It was the airport deal that sunk it. Certainly on my polls and some of the feedback that people were giving us outside of the questions, it was enough for me to believe that that was the #1 issue. And with the revelation that government had to pay 5.4 million as it was in the first quarter and estimated another 15 million, then my view was that all the PLP had to do was remind the public of that disastrous mistake, and that would have been enough in itself. So I think there were so many issues going into this election that the PLP could have fired on, and that could have sunk the OBA. So this is very critical for them. And of course, their advertising, the messaging could not have been worse.
Which, the OBA?
Yes.
Okay.
And so all of that united to the extent to where they are now. 6 seats. I actually didn't think about how many seats there were. I only thought that, well, PLP can get a few more and they would lose a few more. So I guess if you start off 11, it's going to take you below 10. So for them, and I had said online to Michael Dunkley that I think that that airport deal may result in the OBA not even coming back from. And this election with 6 seats, probably that will probably prove to be true, that there is a long way back, if there is a way back, into the voters' good graces.
And so under normal circumstances, I would posit that a leader that loses a significant majority, in this sense, from 11 down to 6, typically what happens is that leader resigns. Do you foresee, or do you have any insights or comments in terms of a resignation, either as leader or from politics altogether, or how do you see that shaping up?
Well, Bermuda is another world.
Okay.
Now, you saw Jamaica 3 weeks ago, had an election.
Yes.
There was a 37% turnout. The losing leader called his party together and said, look, you need to have a summit.
Yes.
You need to get a new leader. When that's done, I will resign from Parliament.
Okay.
Resign from Parliament.
Completely.
We didn't see that when Michael Dunkley lost.
Yes, yes.
We didn't see that. He hung on, and he hung on in this election, and he feels obviously he has something to offer, and the voters agreed with him. But you would normally see, particularly in such a huge loss, that there's well, in Jamaica's case, which is normal, the leader takes responsibility for it and said, look, I didn't lead you well. I didn't do it. It becomes an I situation, and therefore I must take the fall. And that's what happened. But we haven't seen that. I mean, when the PLP lost, Paula Cox lost her seat. So that never even was part of the equation because she was already gone. So you had to have a new leader. But when the OBA lost the last election, we didn't see that. And we have, and Cannonier, at least his first comment was that he wasn't doing anywhere. I really don't understand that, but that's for him to determine.
Okay. Because what I'll add to that actually is, again, during my canvassing, and I won't go too far into this, but the revelation, if you will, from some of the voters is that he has a trust deficit. And what I mean by that is that some don't trust him the individual, which I found quite surprising because as we go canvassing, and you've been canvassing before, so you understand this, people are very candid on the doorstep. What I'll say to the public is, it's quite refreshing that you knock on someone's door, they know you're there to canvass, they have no idea who you are, however, but they are quite open. They, obviously they talk to you and they share their thoughts quite candidly. And I know that with Mr. Cannonier, what has happened in this instance is that person's thought that he was not, well, I wouldn't just say that he has a trust deficit. And I'll smile also because you may recall that in 2011, when I first ran for seat, it was in number 12 against Cannonier, when Mr. Barrett resigned to allow him to become the leader. And to this day, persons ask me, and do you remember during the debate, as it were, we were on TV actually, he was asked whether he went to public school. He said yes, and then revealed that he had not. He went to private school, he went to public school as a primary school, and then went to 7-day school after that. And so they remind me of that. And then more recently, they reminded me that when he was asked about his candidates, he said he had spoken to his candidates for up to a year. But at least two of his candidates had said themselves that was not the case. And so that was some examples in terms of him having a trust deficit. So I won't go any further than that. But let's talk now for a bit about young people. To what degree do you have any commentary of the young person's involvement? Because I know, again, in number 7, it was interesting in terms of, when I say young people, say maybe age 30 and less, they were very, very instrumental in what we were doing. And so some of them, for example, had called me back to say, well, Mr. Richardson or Anthony, we have a question about X, Y, Z. And it came to the point where I actually went back to 3 of them actually on the Sunday before the election and spent about 2 hours in a conversation. And it was good because they have some real concerns in terms of the integrity of the candidates. They have concerns about education. And I was impressed because they were able to actually not just say I have a problem, but to explain the basis of the problem and then offer solutions. And so do you have any comments in terms of the degree to which young people did or did not participate in this election?
Well, I think it's too early to say. This election was different because this was the first time that seniors were permitted to vote in the advanced poll. So I'm sure a number of thousands would have taken advantage of that.
Okay.
And so on election day, you would have seen a lot of younger voters as a result of that, but only because the older voters, many of them have already voted. Yeah. So you would have sort of distorted picture if you just look at on election day. So it's hard to say what their turnout was, but certainly I know there was certainly quite a bit out. I know the last election, I noticed a good deal of first timers because when I was at the polls, some would ask for assistance. So it's hard to say at this stage, but I think early analysis of the overall, say for instance, for the Progressive Labour Party, I think Jonathan Sterling had done some initial analysis and said, I think somewhere between 7 and 10% of the PLP share of the vote had dropped from, well, not the share of the vote, but support from last time had dropped, whereas it was about 37% with the OBA. So that means that perhaps the PLP held on to most of their voters, including those young voters, younger voters who turned out the last time. So didn't see too much of a fall off. But whereas the OBA, and I'm not sure if they have a tremendous amount of young voters, I would think that they have more the older voters, the older white voters, and the older black voters as well. And I think they were probably the ones who were disillusioned, and they're the ones who didn't show up.
That's interesting. So are you suggesting that some of the OBA voters did not show up?
Oh yeah, that have to be the case.
Based on, well, the initial analysis that Jonathan Sterling did, which showed that it looks like about 37% less people voted for the OBA than did this time. So that means that their voters didn't turn out. And I can go by anecdotal data that there are people who I know who have mentioned, well, the way they talk, et cetera, that would seem to think that they would vote OBA, and they said they weren't going out this time because none of the candidates excited them. And isn't that a first? Because I know
it would definitely be a first.
From my experience, it's been the case that
never happened.
That low voter turnout typically positively impacted the OBA because their voters come out 100% no matter what.
Right. But I think in this election there was a WTP factor. What's the point, right? For their voters, right?
Okay.
If you're not, you mentioned a trust deficit. My polls, I didn't have it in this question. In the past, it had showed that there was trust deficit with the OBA because the question was, who do you think is a party that is as concerned for the ordinary Bermudian? And PLP always won that. And when I used to ask, who is a party that can handle the economy better, it used to be the UBP and the OBA. But in my last couple of polls, excluding this one, the PLP took both of those points there, that they were the party that can manage the economy and the party that was concerned about the voter, the ordinary Bermudian. So when it comes to this whole thing about, you've got 25 seats and you have a trust deficit with the opposition party, and I'll leave the leader out of this for a moment. But if you have a trust deficit with them, and you're not excited enough about the other party's candidates, then one of your options is to stay home. They've never exercised that option before, but clearly in this election, that option was exercised.
That's quite a revelation, because, well, again, I know, but we observed actually in number 7 that the voter turnout was, I think, fairly consistent with 2017. There's maybe 100 voters less to be honest overall. But I was excited to know that the actual, well, to put it bluntly, I suppose, that for the white voters, they came out, but during canvassing, they did say that, Anthony, we will basically take a chance. And on some occasions, what happened is they would call me back. I would be there for an extended period of time, sometimes as much as an hour, discussing different issues. And then I would challenge them to say that if you really want to have change, you must be the change that you want to see. And by that I meant that they had to take the chance and vote PLP. And so it took a while, but yeah, in many cases that's what took place. And we have not yet had a chance to do a detailed analysis. But clearly, I do expect to find that some of the white voters did in fact come across. And I think you and I talked briefly about this earlier, in that for the first time, it is probably correct that the white voter became the swing voter, because typically what you have is you know more than I would actually. You would have the black middle class voters would be the swing voters. But this time it seemed to be different. Do you have any sense of that?
That is a possibility based on the numbers and the size of the wins. And when you look at some of the seats that weren't expected, mind you, over there in Pembroke, was it Pembroke West, where Marcus ran? I'm not sure of that. I was tipped off earlier that there's a possibility that I can't remember who's the president PLP again.
Josh A. Adams.
Josh A. Adams
Might be the youngest MP actually.
there was a possibility that he could win because he was the nephew of not so much Gene Atherton, but the nephew of
Sadly.
yes, and that
Grandson.
yeah, so that could have been a factor in his favor. So when that result came through, it wasn't a total surprise to me. But when you look at the areas, Smith South, but then I didn't realize, I heard that John Barrett was canvassing, but I thought that was just a rumor until I read it. And so it's things like that. So if he had any influence, and then there was the other one that was held by the OBA. I can't remember which one it was, but yeah. So that and for that to happen, there had to have been, I think, at least some of those white voters who had not voted for the PLP before to vote this time for you to get that kind of result.
And the one thing I think that some of us don't know or don't remember is that Dan Brown Evans played a pivotal role in assisting some of our Portuguese residents going way back, right? But I never saw the reflection of her assistance to the Portuguese community in the Portuguese voting on block or in any significant way for the PLP. Do you have any sense of them switching their allegiance or taking a chance? I know again from my canvassing, there was one person in particular that called me back, and again we set off on a Friday evening, and she explained her concerns, and they revealed that yes, Anthony, I'm going to vote PLP, and that actually happened on more than one occasion. So, do you have any sense of the Portuguese vote now changing or becoming more neutral or married between the PLP and the?
Well, again, it's in my opinion, it's too early. But I can only go on anecdotal data, and so for instance, you had the holiday that was given by David Burt, and then you had the change in law. The interview with the young Portuguese who's been here for all his life, and now he's eligible for status. So those things obviously had an impact. The extent to which they had an impact, obviously, is too early to tell. But these little anecdotal things could point to something more substantive once you analyze the data.
And you keep referring to the fact that it's too early to analyze data. So what do you do as a statistician to go through information and like what do you actually do succinctly in terms of researching or doing whatever to analyze the results for this election?
So the first thing I'll probably do when I sit down would look at the swing vote, the swing to the PLP. So in order to get 5 additional seats, you have to have some swing. Even though the turnout was lower, what was the swing? And then once you determine the swing, whether it's 3%, 4%, 5%, or whatever it is, to the PLP, then you have to think about, well, what caused that? What was the result of that? And that's where, when you're doing polling, you tend to pick up some anecdotal data. For instance, when we did the last one during the 2017 election, when we came to the question, in the upcoming question, which party you were going to vote for, there's one gentleman, I think it was in C14, white Bermudian, and he said, let me say this to you. He said,
what a raise our volume.
Okay. I keep thinking I've got to go closer to the mic, but anyway, he said, let me tell you this. He said, all my life I voted either UBP or OBA. But he said, this election, I'm going to vote for the PLP. And before the voter could say, well, why would you do that? He said, I'll tell you. He said, it's because of the airport, right?
Yeah.
That airport. So when I had the poll that said 75% of Bermudians, voters, were against having that airport foreign owned, it was largely ignored by the government, as Dame Jennifer would say, to the peril.
Yes.
Right? And so this is the kind of anecdotal data that you say, that's the strength of that airport. They totally ignored it. And what the public doesn't know, though I revealed it at the other interview, was that we did a poll about a year later, and we asked the same question. And the opposition to the airport was within the margin of error. So it was about 68% as opposed to the 75. So 1 year later, you still had this strong opposition to the airport. It was not off the voters' agenda.
Okay.
And so when you go to the polls and that's on the voters' mind, the results speak for themselves. Of course, there were other issues. That's why my feeling was that it was the airport that was the single most issue that caused the PLP landslide the last election.
Oh.
I'm thinking the goodwill factor probably was in place, but of course the earliness of the election, right? Even though the OBA was saying call the election, or you're going to call the election,
Yeah.
and I was just on Facebook was just saying if I were David Byrd, I'll call the election, or if John Swoon was he would call the election. I just did not think. I was just playing along with it because there was an ideal opportunity from a purely political perspective to go to the polls. And in fact, I said the only reason I wouldn't go to the polls right now if I were leader is because of the pandemic, right? But I did say that the United States is going to the polls, Jamaica has gone to the polls, democracy continues. So there will be no reason. And in fact, I never vocalized it, but I said, if I were going to go to the polls, I would go in October when it's still warm. You've got a holiday and for the school break in the third week of October. But then Premier David Byrd came on and said, well, the law says you have to have it by the 4th.
The by-election.
The by-election. So if you're going to have an election, you've got to have it either on the 4th or before the 4th. That's when it all made sense. Because I would say you don't want to wait to November. You don't want to go, and certainly you've got the hotels being closed, the benefit. And see, that was the other thing that probably was a factor. The unemployment benefit.
Yes.
And how many people that helped. And the humanitarian aspect of it, going to a number of meetings as well. So all of these things we're seeing as something, that's what a responsible government does.
Yes.
That's what a caring government does. So when you try to sort of put it all together, there was a tremendous amount of goodwill for the PLP going into the election.
Okay. And I've said actually publicly also that given what I do professionally or privately, I suppose that the Premier also played a direct hand in bringing back Bermudans who were stranded overseas.
Yes.
Whether they were old, some persons were old and others were students, but he did make it very clear to me that, listen, Anthony, in order for flights to come to Bermuda, we must take every opportunity to bring back Bermudans. And so for the first time, many Bermudans flew on private jets to get back home safely. And so that, of course, did add to it. And I know, not anecdotally, but I know factually, how some of those persons who either they themselves or their family members were able to come back. And they were very much appreciative of what the Premier had done. So that went very, very well.
Well, I can say just on that note, I was one of those parents.
There you go.
My daughter was over there, and when we couldn't get her on that last flight, she was extremely disappointed.
Okay.
And so fortunately for us, her sister, who graduated last year, I think it was, is still in the UK, so she had somewhere to go. But when that flight was announced, she was able to get on that flight and get back home. And of her own volition, I must say, she did take it upon herself to write to the Premier to thank him.
Excellent. So let me take two things I want to make sure I address before we cover. One is that a young person said to me that, well, the OBA ads during the election campaign were actually only attacking the PLP, and none of them actually said what the OBA would do. And you commented earlier in terms of the campaign, if you will, the messaging was off. What do you mean by that?
Well, it was highly negative. It was sort of an act of desperation, if you will. If you compare that to the 2012 campaign, which was second to none, then you compare it with this one. They had words in the campaign like dodgy. Now, for us who've been to school in Britain, knew that was written by a British person because that's not a language that we use. So the person who was helping them didn't connect with the voters. And then there was this white male, probably American or Canadian voiceover in their ads. These types of things tend to rub Bermudians the wrong way. You can't even get a Bermudian to do your ads. You can't even get a Bermudian to write your script for you. And you've got these foreign words in there. So that's what I meant by the messaging was totally off. And then, of course, what message were they sending?
Mhm.
It wasn't saying, well, this whole thing about we will do better.
Right.
That was completely a non-starter, because in several conversations, many of us had the same thing. That's like the errant partner
Mhm.
who's going around with everybody else and gets caught and goes back and says, I will do better. And the partner who they're asking them to take back says, well, how do I know you're going to do better? What proof do I have that you're going to do better? They caught themselves in that trap, and that slogan itself,
Right. We. Right.
it just did not resonate. If you want to win, we will do better. Then the first question the voters ask is, you done badly already, so you're asking me to give you a second chance. The question is, why should I give you that second chance?
Okay, thank you for that. The other point you made, which I found also to be true during my canvassing, is that we currently have the Minister of Finance, Curtis Dickinson,
Mm-hmm.
very well trained, experienced, and all the rest of it, and by many accounts, actually the best Minister of Finance we've had, period. During my canvassing
That's
again,
a biased statement. I'm just joking.
Maybe biased, right? But I can tell you that during canvassing, from many persons, the comment was, well, listen, Anthony, we're going to consider the PLP for the first time, and this from those who have voted OBA consistently. One person told me that they have voted OBA and UVP consistently for the past 30 years. However, they had seen Premier Brett is heading up the COVID pandemic. They had seen Premier Brett in the international business meetings, and similarly for Curtis Dickinson as the Minister of Finance. And so those two together collectively were able to project, in fact, and also project, I suppose, that the PLP has a very strong economic base. And I've said myself to others that if you look at the team that the PLP put forward, person for person, they would definitely, in any objective measure, outweigh, outshine, outperform the OBA on a one-to-one basis. And so I was quite interested in your comment just now that it appears that when you ask the question during polling, that the PLP are now seen as the better party to handle Bermuda's economics or Bermuda's economy. And so how do you see that playing going forward? Because that was always the OBA's claim to fame, in that the PLP might be better on a personal level, but not on an economic or business level. And if now it's changed, right, whereby the PLP, are winning both those primary points on a humanitarian basis and economic basis, then what future do you have for OBA?
Well, you just answered the question. No, I think in the pages of the Daily, there was somebody who mentioned the fact that of all the persons who could possibly be finance minister, they would go with Curtis Dickinson. They are not likely to vote PLP, but they'll be happy if he was the finance minister.
Okay.
So he has, of course, the bank. He has all the credentials too, So it's seen as somebody who is in safe, who has the country in safe hands.
Yes.
And so as we go into the what's perceived as economic turbulence over the next, according to my poll, the next 2 to 3 years, they want somebody they can trust. And so if you've got a person who has the skills in banking, who has the skills in the economy, who is at the helm, and you've got a party who has been able to manage, let's face it, the worst economic and health crisis in 100 years, and manage it very, very well, then perhaps you do want to maintain. You go with, there's no reason to change. So you took that quantum leap to, is there a way back for the OBA? Well, that's going to be determined over these next 2 to 3 years. Now, one of the things they have done, the government has borrowed the money to sort of make up for the deficits they expect to incur. So that will take you through the next 3 years. And so if the economy starts to come out in those next 2 to 3 years, then we can start to see the paying down of the debt and all of those things. And so all of this would have been well worth it. It just depends on what things are going to be like and how bad they are going to be in the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay. As we get closer to time to wrap up, I just want to give a few comments actually, and they will refer back to what you said earlier. In some instances, one of which is that to me, the greatest surprise was in fact in C9 with Vance Campbell
Mhm.
when he won the OC that was held by Trevor Hunnam. And when I say surprised, because similar to your experience, I was actually in the obviously in C7, and I went in for the count myself, and I noted that the count took from 8:40 to 10:40, so it took 2 hours to count us all the way through. And clearly, I knew that I had won.
Mhm.
And then as I left, my team, as I drove down Harrington's Road, my team came honking horns, right?
Mhm.
And so I came straight to Hamilton. And it wasn't until maybe 30 minutes later that I found out that the Vance Campbell had won C9.
Mhm.
And to me, it was the biggest surprise because of the actual people that lived there
Mhm.
that have been a big switch. That was brilliant. And I will pause just to say, because I know we always get this wrong, in that there were so many people behind the scenes that assisted in getting me through in this instance. And so for C7, of course, there was a lot of persons conducting what we call phone banking, and they were behind the scenes calling everybody. We had I think from my branch, we have a good number of support persons that would help out in various areas. And for this time around, what was particularly helpful and insightful, I think, was that we had a dedicated social media team. And so, as I said earlier, one thing they challenged me to do is to write a Anthony Says, which is published every weekday morning, mostly by 7:30. And then we had, as we're doing tonight, for example, I have a new YouTube channel, which is new to me, to be honest, but we have it, and we now broadcast things there. We use Instagram, of course, and Facebook, and many others. So I want to make sure that I recognize my team. I am intentionally not calling any names, because if I call names, I'm going to forget some names and get in trouble. But what we are going to do is, for our entire volunteers, is we're having a celebration on Friday, and we're just work at 6:30. We're working out a surprise component of that, so I won't give any more details, except that I know they've been sent a message to save the date. So Friday at 6:30, anyone at C7 and C9, please make sure you save that date. It's going to be important for us to celebrate together. And I also want to add that on a go forward basis in C7, as part of our canvassing, we actually got a new phone number. And the phone number is 538-8683, which is really 538 vote. And that allowed us to ensure that if anybody in that constituency have any questions, issues, concerns, they'll call that number and it will always be answered, because it doesn't matter who has the physical phone, they will be able to answer that. And then, of course, my email address is arichardson@plp.bm. And so going forward, we should be able to have a much more consistent response to the electorate. And I say that because the previous person did not really connect consistently with the community. And I know that as part of my canvassing, that's been one of the major requirements that, Anthony, we are going to, in some cases, give you a chance, but you must then make sure that you remain in contact. And going forward, I got some emails already, and they're saying, well, Anthony, we're looking forward to what you're going to do. And I said, we must change the you to we, because it's not about me, it's about we. And in doing so, that's how we're going to go forward. And I've also proposed, again, based upon conversations and canvassing, that we're going to establish what I call a League of Champions. A League of Champions is going to be whereby, let's say, if you stay in that constituency, and you might stay on under Redwood Hill, we will then come to the community and ask for a champion that will speak for that community. And then we'll put together all the neighborhood champions, and then we'll look to figure out to what degree are your concerns consistent with the other neighborhoods. And then to the degree that they are, we'll formulate a plan to go back to government through me. And then the reverse will take place in terms of I'll bring back the answer to the community through the same process. And so the goal is going to be to ensure that there is very strong accountability, so that the concern around the idea that Bermuda needs to have a strong opposition has been addressed by me saying you can actually fix that by ensuring that there is greater accountability from me as the elected member now to you and back to the government. And so that's what we're gonna work that through. And I'm looking forward to be very exciting. And the other aspect I'm going to try to put in place, is, for example, we have a strong concern with education in number 7. And so the goal is going to be to get together a group of persons, again, volunteering themselves, who are interested in education, and then to the degree that government's going to do anything with education, I'll refer that to that group. And so that group becomes the experts to give me that feedback on what the issue is. Let's say, for example, it's education and maybe health. It's going to be those persons who are going to be responsible for doing any detailed research, for example, feed that back to me, and I'll feed that to government. And so hopefully that'll be a way whereby we have the good interchange. And as you know, also in Bermuda, all politics are local, and we are used to actually canvassing. Well, people want you to canvass, and so we have a process in place by which we do canvass regularly to stay in touch with the electorate.
Excuse me, Anthony. Jamal Allboy said League of Champions is a great idea.
And we also always give a shout out to Jamal Oldboy, because he is one in the community, and I wouldn't say where he stays, but in his neighborhood, the thought would be that, subject to his neighborhood agreeing, he will be the champion in the neighborhood, and very involved in the community. Also going to work towards enhancing or strengthening the neighborhood watches, because that there is the criminal element, and we need to make sure that the neighborhood feels safe. And so we're going to ensure that we do that. But others have asked the question in terms of how does the Smith Parish Council differ from my proposal of the League of Champions? And just so everyone knows, the difference is that the Smith Parish Council is appointed by the minister. The League of Champions will be recommended by the neighborhoods. And so it's going to be one of those, what I call a natural selection of a leader. And so, for example, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, professional or otherwise, you may be deemed as being the natural spokesperson for the community, and therefore you'll be that champion. And so I think that's will work differently. As we wrap up, you know also, Kadal, being from the area, there is the ongoing sensitivity around the displacement of many persons from the toughest town into Davos Hill. And I did write a small article in terms of, if you look at the actual residents in the Hill constituency, you have blacks in the middle, and white Bermudians actually own all the properties on the water side, with the exception of Talbot Lane and Darrell Clover. And so we're going to look to see how that actually pans out. We know it wasn't by accident, it was by design. But that's a small but big example in terms of one of the issues that we're looking to do, because persons in the constituency want to have greater cohesion among black, white, old, young, whatever. So I think that's going to also come out of the League of Champions. And then finally, it's that we do have 3 major tourist accommodations in the Rio, which would be DeLorean, Military Club, and Tapas Point. And so working with them to figure out the degree to which they can combine with us and work with us to primarily, to be honest, fund the club renovations. That's going to be very important. And so I'm told that my time is up. So I want to thank you, Kadal. Again, I recognize you as being a friend, a co-attendee at Work Academy, but also I think as being one of the most objective persons when it comes to political commentary. You're very involved in the community. And so I want to say thank you again. And thank C7 for making history. Thank you.
Great. We'll see. I'll have a watch. Is it going to be on your YouTube channel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we gonna repost it on the Facebook page?
Yeah.
As this audio was bad, that audio.
Okay. So my